our presentation today is entitled Best Practices for Exam Preparation, focusing on the human learner. And so I think this fits in quite nicely with the presentations that we've seen so far in the last presentation with Phil and also with Lucy's keynote this morning, that it's looking at this human learner and how we can approach learners in a way that's maybe personalized and what kind of advice we can give to learners, specifically in this context for approaching exams. So when we talk about best practice, in this situation, we're not particularly concerned with things like exam techniques or how to do this particular question on this particular paper. We're talking, I guess, more broadly about what we mean by best practice and the idea of what students can do best in order to prepare for exams, looking at this more maybe psychological side of learning and drawing from research and things in areas like psycholinguistics. And so for this presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some kind of theoretical context on the areas of like learner psychology, I suppose, that have informed this presentation. And then Tony's going to talk about looking at this in context with students in different contexts around the world. And looking then, I suppose, at what we can do to make these learning situations better for learners so that way they can, I guess, approach their learning in a more clever way, in a more useful way. And so the areas of research that we looked into for this were many. So we looked at things like metacognitive learning strategies and cognitive learning strategies. We looked at the role of beliefs and looking at how beliefs around intelligence can impact upon learning. We looked at things like emotions, and this largely was concerned with things like learning anxiety or test anxiety. We looked at the role of the environment and how we could consider, I guess, the context in which we're learning and what we can do differently in order to facilitate learning. The importance of feedback and the approaches that we take to feedback in learning, and also looking at things like learning-oriented assessment and how valuable that can be. And again, all of this, thinking about the learner and thinking about these feelings around exams that we hear time and again, that teachers are finding it difficult for students who are very stressed leading up to taking these exams, and then also obviously the learners and their feelings surrounding taking exams. So for the first bit, looking at these three areas, I'm going to give you a little brief overview of what we see in the research more broadly on metacognition, beliefs, and emotions, and then Tony's going to tell you a bit about that in context. So when we talk about metacognitive strategies, I think that metacognition is one of those words that seems kind of heavy and weighted, but is in fact very accessible and can be summarized in something such as this. Learners use metacognitive strategies to monitor and control their own learning, and they can be applied to all learning contexts. So looking at things like forethought and planning, monitoring, learners in control of their own learning, and the importance of learners reacting to the kind of feedback they're getting and learners reflecting on their overall learning processes. And this then can impact a number of different things, like the way learners think, the way learners feel about learning, what they do with all of that in the classroom, and how they approach tasks more broadly. I think what's key to keep in mind with metacognition is how explicit this is. So we're looking at really engaging learners in their learning process, not subtly and not in a way that makes them do this without them knowing, but quite explicitly getting them to think about their learning and what they can do with that. And I'm going to come back to this in a little bit where I give you some more tangible examples of what this looks like in the classroom. But broadly, if we think about it in terms of this, learners monitor and control their own learning. In terms of beliefs, what we see in the research are arguments about the differences, I guess, between fixed beliefs and incremental approaches to beliefs, or this idea of a growth mindset. So fixed beliefs about intelligence, this is where we think that we have a certain capacity and that's it. We can't do any better, this is how good we are, and we're limited to this. And this can have quite negative impacts on learning more broadly. So it can have difficulties, I suppose. Students will feel helpless in response to challenges and failures, so they won't necessarily know what to do or how they can address it. Students can have a low self-worth. They have negative emotions such as anxiety or fear. Lack of persistence in learning, so there's a higher dropout. They are less, I suppose, pay less attention to constructive feedback and engage less with constructive feedback. And also just broadly less reflective in general, so they're not engaging in their own learning process. Whereas what we see in contexts where teachers and classroom cultures adopt a more incremental approach to intelligence, we see there's more enjoyment surrounding learning. Students are more engaged. There's more of an intrinsic motivation for learners. This mastery learning goal orientation, I think, links a little bit to the keynote this morning as well, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. But effectively what this means is that when students can see the capacity in themselves to develop and to continue to learn, that they can approach language learning with I suppose, a view that they can eventually master this language and that they're not going to be pigeoned at one particular point. And then overall, I guess there's more achievement. And then lastly, the literature surrounding emotions and anxiety, largely centered on this concept of foreign language anxiety. So the kind of anxieties that students feel when they're learning a language. And this, I guess, is because they're putting themselves in high-risk situations quite often. They're exposing themselves to making errors. And I think anyone who's learned another language can I suppose, relate to that feeling, that kind of feeling of putting yourself out there. But there are lots of different things to consider, whether or not these are personal and interpersonal anxiety. So is this something that is a trait of the particular person that's in this classroom, or is this something that's created by this particular classroom? And that's something to consider. What are their own beliefs around language learning, and how is that impacting how they feel about it? And I think maybe what you're seeing already in this is how interrelated all of these different ideas are, that these are not separated. These are all working together. The instructor beliefs about language teaching, so whether teachers view intelligence as fixed or as incremental, has obviously got a large impact on their students. The relationship between teachers and learners, the overall classroom practices and how these might be facilitating some type of anxiety or how these might not be. And then also, of course, language testing. So looking broadly at these three areas now of metacognition, of emotions and beliefs. Tony's going to talk a little bit about this in context.
Okay, thanks very much, Niall. So, yeah, I'm going to expand on what Niall's been saying. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it was actually from a PhD thesis, when I looked into exam preparation. So, putting this in context, I'll tell you what I did. I was a teacher before I became a kind of full-time researcher. And what I had to do was get students ready to take the IELTS exam. I was based in Japan. And I kind of felt like I wanted to know more about the process. So I did the intensive course. It lasted 5 weeks. And we worked really, really hard to get these students up to the kind of levels that we wanted them to be at. But I didn't know what happened to them afterwards. So Japan was one of the countries I included because of my connections to that. And I also added in China as well. We've got 90,000 Chinese students in the UK. And I felt it was a really valuable addition to the project. So what I basically wanted to look into was, what are the main challenges Chinese and Japanese students face when preparing for IELTS? I focused on writing. I had to choose something, so it's a big topic. I felt writing was particularly important. And I also wanted to look at how they get on with university study after they've successfully passed the IELTS exam, as it were. So were they then able to write in a university context? So what I did, I went out to Japan and I watched a full test preparation course. So I was there for 2 months. And I also went to China as well for 6 months. I watched the full course in either country, by the way, in both countries. And that really gave me an idea of what was going on there, what kind of challenges students faced and what teachers did in response to these, and also how successful that was. Not easy to get students from quite a low level of English in a short time to a high enough level to pass the exam. So this is what I did. I observed the classes, as I said, and I also conducted semi-structured interviews. So I wanted to speak to the students, they were the most important, but also the teachers as well. Find out basically what their biggest problems were, how they felt about the exam preparation process, and anything else they wanted to share about it, because I felt that students don't always get asked about these things. And neither do teachers, actually. I also collected the written homework from both courses. That's because I just wanted to see if anything was recurring in the essays they were writing. It'd be unusual to see a huge improvement in a matter of weeks. But but I wanted to have a look anyway. So, I've separated this into nodes or categories, just to kind of show you the overall topics and themes that came out of the classroom observations, first of all. This is in both China and Japan. So, if we have a look at the silver boxes there, generating ideas to write an essay was a big problem for both sets of students. Now, I can't say I can write about all of China or all of Japan, that would be ridiculous. I also can't say I'm comparing China and Japan. There's a very small sample sizes. But the two groups I looked at, they struggled a lot with generating ideas to write IELTS essays. So the teacher would give a topic and they'd say, well, I've never thought about this topic before, or I don't know about this topic. How can I write about it? And this touches on what Niall mentioned about learners having those kind of beliefs that they are limited in some way. Now, I looked at where that came from by asking them, and a lot of the students said that their previous education had not given them the experience to write about the topics that IELTS then required them to do. In the IELTS course, somehow that gap had to be bridged, but it's not easily done. Structuring an essay was another big problem for students, particularly in the Japanese school I looked at. Laying out paragraphs in a kind of Western style, or the way that English students might, was a challenge for them. It's not like that in Japanese. Gradually, the influence of English is affecting how Japanese texts are laid out, but it's still a lot for students to take on board. I'll look at another one there, language of instruction. So that's something we mentioned as well. In the Japanese school, it happened to be 2 English teachers, as in 2 teachers from England. The Chinese school had local teachers. And again, neither were better or worse or anything like that, but it was a different thing. The Chinese teachers used Chinese language in the classrooms, which made it a bit more challenging for me to understand exactly what was going on. But we did manage. The Japanese school was only in English, but I'd be keen to make the point that Lucy was making earlier, that it's not black and white enough to say one is better than the other like that. I just want to kind of remake that point. Feedback strategies, again, that's something Niall mentioned. So feedback strategies differed in each school, but they both had the same goal, to help students improve their writing. In the Chinese school, for example, they had kind of whole class feedback sessions. So they would get one of the students' essays up on there, homework essays up on the screen, and they'd all look at it together. In the Japanese school, it was done differently. More kind of teacher looks at it, corrects it, gives it back to the student in a cycle. So that was what came out of my observations of the classroom there. In terms of the interviews, so as I mentioned, considerable topic knowledge deficiencies. Quite a lot of students believed that they didn't have enough knowledge to answer these questions. And it was all about how the teacher could help them access that knowledge if it already was there, or develop it if it wasn't there. Again, easier to say than do. If we look at the kind of middle box there, the middle silver one, prior English education, old versus new. Okay, so what some of the students said was, English education in my country when I was a child wasn't great, but it's improved a lot in recent years. Some of them said, we've not had the full benefits of that. It will be future generations, especially the older ones. No internationally transferable essay template. Okay, so quite a lot of students just wanted a quick fix to the problem. Can you give me a template and I'll go away and write an essay based on that? That would be really handy, but of course we know it doesn't work that way. And then down at the bottom there, we look at the yellow ribbon. Chinese thinking and Chinese logic. One of the students said to me something I thought was quite sad. He said, I'd like to change my ways of thinking from the Chinese way to the correct way. And I just thought, that's such a shame that you think I want to hear that. But there were misunderstandings like that. One of the teachers actually said to me he'd like to speak to me so he could understand my Western mind. And again, that's an interesting thing to say. He hadn't met somebody like me before. I don't know what insights I would bring to him, but he did want to know that. In the Japanese interview, some similar things, some different things. For example, topic knowledge, another one, another big problem. Paragraphing, as I said, taking a position and offering an opinion was particularly problematic for the Japanese students. That might not be a surprise to some of you who've worked in similar contexts or from these contexts, but it was all about how this could be developed to help them with the IELTS. So it's not impossible, would be my message. You can get students to overcome these beliefs and emotions they have. So this was the first part of my research, the biggest part. There was a second part which I'll come to later on. But just to kind of show you the sort of things that affect students when they're preparing for IELTS or preparing for an exam. In the orange circle there, we've got individuality of experience. That's a point I want to mention. This was a much more complicated thing than I thought to investigate, specifically because people are quite different, even within one nationality or one classroom. That doesn't mean that we can't do research about it, but I was very wary about having black and white conclusions about things. Prior educational influence, okay, we mentioned that. Quite a lot of students from both countries mentioned that their thoughts had been stifled. Their creativity had been stifled, they felt, by their teachers before that. And then they're asked to write these essays for IELTS. I feel it's unfair on the students. I don't know where the truth is exactly and all that, but it's not really fair on the students along the way. And I would say IELTS probably needs to think about that. So yeah, so we had all these things feeding into IELTS writing preparation. Down the bottom are the kind of strategies that we might think of. So, for example, strategies to help students generate ideas, organising and structuring paragraphs, Lexis and the mechanism. This was a Chinese, very experienced Chinese instructor, and he said to me, he called it triggering the mechanism. He said, knowledge is there. It's connected to Lexis. If you can give students enough vocabulary to express themselves, they're no longer going to say, I don't know about that topic, I can't write about it. His colleague disagreed, actually, and said, okay, but you need reading, you need input. If you're going to write about something, first you need knowledge. So a combination of what they said, I think, is quite interesting to me. Critical thinking work was another one. Again, a very big topic for students coming to study in the UK. And feedback models as well. So how to effectively manage feedback. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the background impact of previous education, different educational traditions, and consequent thinking. Okay, so stifled thoughts and limited creativity. C&J stands for, of course, China and Japan there. Other effective factors, so tertiary study, overseas experience. Some students had studied abroad, basically, and of course that affected how well they could prepare for English. It was much, much easier if they'd learned in an English-speaking context. So just to conclude this part, that's a kind of overview of how complicated the exam preparation process can be. There's so much in there. I would like to speak about it for a very long time, but I definitely can't do that. So I'd like to hand over to Niall again and think about what teachers could do in these situations.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, I think that what this data kind of brings to light, and although, like Tony said, he'd love to have spoken about it for much longer, I think what it brings to light and what we've seen is that this is a very real problem for students. Students are in this situation having to take exams and maybe don't necessarily have the strategies they need in order to be able to undertake these exams. Perhaps they have the linguistic input, perhaps they have the exam technique, but this maybe more holistic approach is something that they may need. And so when we think about what the research surrounding metacognition says for what teachers can do in the language classroom, it's largely about getting students thinking about thinking. And so here we have several different, I suppose, very tangible tasks or activities that teachers could do in the language classroom organized according to effect size that show what we can do. So for example, getting students to self-assess and getting students to look at what they're doing, comparing themselves to what they did before, and then looking at, I suppose, monitoring their own improvement. Getting students to set individual goals for themselves. When we think about the issues surrounding creativity, getting students to imagine things, you know, using these particular skills. But again, I think what's super important for all of this is that it's very explicit, so that we're not just getting students to do this, but we're getting students to do this because this will help you do whatever it is that you need to do. And it's another way, I guess, of personalizing the approach towards exam preparation, that students will be able to find where their weaknesses are and do something to support that. When we think about what teachers can do in terms of beliefs, I mean, again, I think this comes back to this idea of student-centered but teacher-directed that came up earlier on today. So this is largely about letting teachers know that, I suppose, their actions surrounding beliefs have impacts on what the students then believe about intelligence. And when we think about teacher development, we need to, I suppose, consider that we're educating teachers as to what beliefs about intelligence are, what positive and negative impacts can happen from holding these beliefs, skill training on how to exemplify incremental mindsets in classrooms. So how can we create a culture in a classroom that supports the idea that you can progress? And so I suppose a simple thing with something like this is at the beginning of a unit when a student does a test to see what they know and they inevitably don't do terribly well because they haven't learnt those items yet, that they see that as an opportunity for learning and not as an evaluation of their ability, so that we're creating this kind of culture of it's okay to get things wrong. And then skills training on, I guess, on creating and encouraging these environments. Similarly with anxiety and emotions, largely, I guess we need to be able to get students to address and attend to these emotions because they're there. And these, before exams, we've all seen or been anxious and stressed. So it's about getting students to recognize them and also to recognize, I guess, this link between physical symptoms and what's happening around the exam, and that they're able to understand themselves better. Including things like mindfulness training, using the foreign language in different contexts, so this is kind of linguistic. Avoiding competition, and this will come up again in another moment, but avoiding competition with your peers and focusing more on your own development, not necessarily thinking about what somebody else is doing, but focusing on what you're doing. This one is very important, this idea of familiarizing yourself with the assessment format. So it's not to forget that we are still taking an exam at the end of the day, and familiarizing yourself with the format is very effective in reducing anxiety because it makes students aware of what they're going to see and how they're going to, I guess, deal with that. Talking about anxiety, so feeling free to talk about these kind of stresses that everybody feels. And then also, I guess, in more serious contexts, a recommendation could be made to deal with, for therapy or to deal with a psychologist. So that's obviously at the teacher's discretion. But what we saw, I think, over all of these three areas here in terms of what Tony spoke about in the language classroom and what I spoke about in terms of what impact these have on learning is that we can see that there's a very real need to implement these into language learning in some way. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about these three areas, and then Tony's going to give a little more context as well. So environment and goal orientation, what we're talking about here is these three. And so it was kind of quite nice to see this morning this idea about mastery of learning, which I guess was looking at it in a different context, this idea of focusing in the detail and seeing, doing less but in more detail. But here, when we think about mastery, we're talking about getting students to see their language learning and their position for language learning as an approach to mastering the language, and not as an approach to seem to master the language, which is what we want to avoid. So when we have students doing performance prove, they basically want to outperform others, and their motivations would largely be for getting good grades, but maybe less about identifying their strengths and weaknesses. They would largely want some kind of affirmation. They have very emotional reactions to their learning process, so if it's not going well, it's a very emotional reaction. And I think this last one and this first one, competitiveness and seeking easier tasks, link quite well, that students who are in a performance-prove mindset will put themselves in positions where they can succeed, but won't necessarily challenge themselves and push themselves on to do something more. And then we have on the other end, performance avoid, which are students who want to avoid looking less intelligent to other students. So what they will do is create opportunities to disrupt the class so that they don't have to, I suppose, show their weaknesses. They will create situations where they can limit themselves from doing something. So that way they may, for example, a night before an exam, they may stay up really late all night. So then they come in the next day and they're like, oh, I was really tired. That's why I did so poorly in that exam. And so they're not giving themselves opportunities to succeed. And also just not engaging with feedback or learning tasks. What we really want to do is we want to move students towards mastery. And this, again, I think will pull on some of the points I made earlier on surrounding metacognition. It looks like getting people to really engage with their learning. to give them, I suppose, more attention to their feedback that they're getting and figuring out how to process feedback, getting them to enjoy their learning, and I think crucially, not getting them to compete with each other, but getting them to compete with themselves. So monitoring their own progress, seeing what they did last time and how they can do better next time. When we think about feedback then, we have quite an array, and I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. What's, I guess, important with this is what we don't want to do is think of it as a taxonomy. This is not, this feedback is best and this feedback is worst. It's not that. What we have here, I suppose, is to think about taking an eclectic, varied, and purposeful approach to giving feedback. So when is it good to give descriptive feedback or evaluative feedback? Or when do we need to give more procedural feedback? And these would be relative to students' particular needs, to particular pedagogical goals. And the point of this really is just to get us thinking about making these decisions and making these choices based on students' needs. And then lastly, learning-oriented assessment. So thinking about assessment tasks as learning tasks, crucially seeing the student involvement in this whole process, and then looking at feedback again. So again, I think feedback is coming up time and again is really important. And so to summarize this, so the qualitative evaluation of student work gathered over an extended period of time has the potential to reveal something of the individual's ability to recognize, respond, and reproduce the target language in less controlled conditions as one might in a more authentic linguistic context. So really the point here is about getting students involved in their assessment process and getting students to take something out of their assessment process so that the assessment here is guiding their learning. And so these, again, were some of the core areas that came up in our research, and Tony's going to talk a little bit about how that relates to the classroom.
Thank you. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the second part of my study was based in the UK. So I took previous IELTS students who had passed the exam, who got the score they needed, and basically followed up to see how they were getting on. Were they managing with their writing, with their course, and some of the aspects Niall mentioned, the emotional side of it, and had their beliefs changed at all. The point is that it's not just about exam preparation. There's much more beyond that. Something comes after exam preparation, and I think it's important to look forward as well. Okay, so this was done over a 2-month period. I just interviewed students this time. I collected some assignments, but that wasn't the main form of data collection. So when it came to UK study experiences, Chinese and Japanese students on postgraduate courses, I just did master's courses, were having recurring difficulties. Now they were having problems with critical thinking. How do they learn to write academically? Lecturer feedback on language depended on personal preference. So some lecturers would say, I really want to correct all this English. Some would say, well, that's not the point. I'm not correcting it at all. And students got a kind of inconsistent response. Group planning, as Niall mentioned and other people have mentioned, it worked for many, but not all. Okay, so as Phil said, some students might be an introvert, for example, or some cultures, preparing something in a group is not commonly done in the education system. We need to accommodate that, because you don't just dump it on people and say everyone's doing something in a group. It doesn't always work that way. If you are going to do that, you have to give the proper support. Learning as you study, a lot of students were learning as they go. Okay? But a good start and a positive attitude seemed to be quite important for the students I spoke to. It seems obvious that, but actually, we'll see it made a difference. So, we've got 4 cases here. Olivia was a Chinese student. She was having a pretty tough time. So she had a negative experience. She was doing a psychology master's. She recently finished it. Problems from start to finish. So she was struggling with critical thinking. She was struggling with her peers. She felt excluded in the activities. It didn't go well at all. She made a little bit of progress, she said, with language development and a little bit with critical thinking. But she was struggling throughout. And she didn't really take help from people. I got that impression. So that was unfortunately a negative experience for her. Masako, a Japanese student, she was several months into her course. She was doing a lot better, actually. She got a high score, she got 7 on writing, made a strong start, and she was already starting to use critical thinking. She'd done a bit before, actually, in a bachelor's and an undergraduate. So she was well set up. She was managing the group planning and the peer feedback. Saturn, that was her name, not mine. She started on a pre-sessional course. She didn't actually get the score she needed, so she was doing this pre-sessional academic study course. Again, that's an interesting part of a student's development if they do these pre-sessional courses. And there they're taught how to think critically, to analyse a text, to organise an essay. But before that, or if they don't do that kind of course, where are they going to learn it from? It's challenging. Hiroko, another Japanese student, she was doing quite well also. She'd actually done quite badly on the IELTS exam and struggled with it. But again, she had a positive attitude. She studied at home. She did extra reading, and she sought help from academic staff. So, professional proofreader as well. So, the good attitude went quite a long way. Willing to improve. So, there's a kind of few summary statements. I mentioned them already. Critical thinking a problem. Inconsistent lecturer feedback. Pre-sessional courses had a big impact, and students with a higher band score, 7 or more on IELTS, were managing better. Attitude and approach after arrival affected performance. Okay. I'd also like to think about how research can help improve this, and what are the practical implications for teaching. Thank you, Niall. Went on to your slide.
No worries. But I think, again, coming back to all of that, what we're seeing is that some of the students who were more successful post-IELTS were students that were using what they learned from IELTS, but also applying these kind of more metacognitive strategies to this kind of help-seeking and looking for ways in which that they could improve and manage their learning. And so what things we could do from I guess, a goal orientation perspective and pushing students towards getting engaged with their learning and looking towards mastery is even things like priming students. So considering praise and how we word praise, considering what we praise, the format in which something is praised. I think in terms of academic context, looking at what success criteria are set and then how we can use that in order to move students along. And the extent to which learners are encouraged to compare themselves with others is something that comes up time and again. And the more successful learners are the learners that don't necessarily think about other learners. They're thinking about themselves and they're thinking about their own development. In terms of feedback, there's lots we can say about feedback. I'm not going to go through it all. But thinking about the level of detail that we give in feedback, this idea of using open-ended questions, which came up again this morning as well, this idea of just questioning students and getting them to try and think about why they did things and why they didn't do things, and getting them to, I guess, investigate a little bit of their own learning. Using self and peer assessments. So with this one, I think what's important to think about is the utility. So when to use peers and when not to use peers. What are peers able to do that teachers can't do, and what can peers not do that teachers can do? I think when it comes to feedback, it's important and also important that we take an eclectic and responsive approach to using feedback. When we look at things like learning-oriented assessment and the value that that would have for learning, then it's evidence. So being able to look back at what has happened in the language learning process and what you can use. So it'll come from multiple sources, including the learners, that we should look at mapping learning to goals, that we should make it very easy and practical to collect, and this is something that I think teachers can be involved in, and that we should focus on each individual learner, and this should inform their overall progress. So it's, again, a way of making learning very personalized. And that evidence must not be treated as passing or failing, but seeing this, again, more holistically as overall learning and the value that this will have beyond taking the exam when students go into these academic contexts post-IELTS, and what we can do with that, so that way students won't be struggling after their exam. So I think this is you, Tony.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So yeah, in conclusion, I wanted to say that test preparation for international study is a complex process. It's individualistic in nature. Previous education very, very important, as I mentioned, not just for exam preparation, but after it as well. Several key strategies identified, so generating ideas, organisation, critical thinking, introduction, model answer work and feedback. All of that helped the students with exam preparation, and also the strategies Niall mentioned as well. Many UK postgraduates learn as they go. They just pick it up. That can work, but it's also quite challenging. Critical thinking, a significant issue for most candidates, okay. Students with higher band scores did better, basically. Not all lecturers correct the English. Some of them just leave it. Should be a bit of consensus about what's done. So again, that's not necessarily a problem in itself, but I think we do need to support students with this. So it's a complex thing in summary. All of these, you can read them later in depth, but if you think about each of them with the learner in mind, I think they make a lot of sense. This is a study about students, really. Thank you.
And so, I guess looking at this whole process then, there's a real opportunity in helping students and helping scaffold students throughout this learning process and this taking exams, I guess, at international levels, that will help them learn not only for exams, but learn and beyond. The whole thing that we've seen here today with all of these different themes coming out is that it's messy and that it's interconnected and that all of it is very difficult to isolate because we're dealing with humans and humans are messy and interconnected and difficult to isolate. So it's organic and interconnected, but we have this learner focus at the center. We think about their beliefs, we think about the role of metacognition, the importance of the environment, the value of learning-oriented assessment, the implications of feedback, and the importance of considering their emotions, and how all of this is an interplay when preparing for exams. So one kind of simple way to illustrate all of this would be a student seeks help, metacognition. The solution could be to avoid competition, so this is our goal mastery. So now they're not thinking about the other learners, they're going to engage critically with feedback, which is an example of good use of learning-oriented assessment. They're acting upon the feedback, which is good interaction with feedback. This then is getting them to think not necessarily about their passing or failing, but their own progress. So they're using feedback as an impetus to improve. And then what that's doing is it's seeing their skill level as evolving and temporary and creating beliefs around intelligence that are not fixed but incremental. And so I think that looking at learning in this way and incorporating all of these different facets of learning could be really valuable for supporting exams and also for making direct impacts on learning. I think what was quite nice to see this morning in the keynote from Lucy was that the schools that had applied this cognitive approach like across the board were more successful in these examinations. And I think that all of these points make clear why these things work together to create a better learning context. So thank you very much from both of us. And if you have any questions, we're happy to take them.